Welcome to Pad. This segment of Pause Break Reviews takes two games, let's say Cheggers Party Quiz and Crash Bandicoot 2, and slams the two together until it's clear which one is better and which one is worse. Today we're going to be looking at two indie games, one Canadian, one Japanese, one good, one evil, one about a robot saving rabbits, one about protecting the world from, like, you know, universal collapse. Anyway, I think that these allegories are kind of useless because I'm talking about Cave Story and Fez, obviously.
Stop me if you had this one before. An 8-bit indie platformer walks into a bar and... Okay, the market is full to the brim with these, from Super Meat Boy to Bray to Viva Vivi to La Milana to Banana Nababa to you get the point. Indie developers seem to churn these out like Michael Bay churns out explosions, but I think the two most influential to the scene are Cave Story and Fez, each for different reasons that I'll get into later. But which of these behemoths is stronger? A closer look is required. Cave Story, also known in Japanese as Dokutsu Monogatari, was released in 2004 for Windows. You play as an amnesiac robot trapped in the caves of a floating island. As you go through the game, shooting enemies with a variety of weapons and platforming in a mixture of Metroid and Mega Man style, seasoned with some Mario, you come across a race of rabbit dog people things called Mimigas. The Mimigas tell you about their plight, a man known only as the Doctor... Not that Doctor! A man known only as the Doctor is kidnapping Mimigas one by one and feeding them red flowers, thus causing them to promptly hulk the fuck out. He plans to use an army of enraged Mimigas to descend upon the surface of the world below and take over. Standard world domination fare. Cave Story didn't gather much attention in the West until a fan translation made by a group called Aeon Genesis hit the internet and made it a cult hit, but once it did, people were hopping on the craze like rabbits. Or Mimigas, I guess. Anyway, Fez was released last year, or in case you're watching this on Dave, 48 years ago in the long old time ago of 2012, on Xbox Live Arcade. In this game you play as a two-dimensional this thing called Gomez, who lives in a 2D world. One day you're given the ability to change the perspective and move in 2.5D by this old guy, but something goes wrong and the mystical hexahedron that granted you your powers breaks. To save your world from being destroyed, you have to solve puzzles using your new ability, find all the pieces and put it back together. This game had quite a lot of media attention, and it won several awards before it was even released from the indie game community, which is pretty damn impressive. But are they warranted? So now we've got a solid understanding of what each game is and what it's about, let's take a look at the artistic direction. Cave Story's art style is part necessity and part design. The game was put together over the course of 5 years, with the first screenshots coming out in 2001, so during its conception it just looked a little bit dated, like a PS2 era game looks now. However, make no mistake that everything in Cave Story looks wonderful. The characters, while tiny and minimalistic, still keep a sense of charm and detail in them. They're just so dinky and cute. Oh god, what? Everything seems to have a sense of volume and depth, especially the bosses in the backgrounds. Be aware I'm basing this off the 2004 original release though, not the updated WiiWare or 3DS ports. I ain't no cheater. Oh, Mr. T-Mobile. Fez's graphics are probably inspired by Cave Story, considering how similar they look, but are nonetheless impressive, especially considering the Trixel engine used on the environment to create the 2.5D effects. Psst! Hey Polytron! They're called voxels! Red Alert 2 use them! Anyway, while the environments often seem a bit flat, compared to Cave Story at least, I guess they look nice. It's interesting whenever you come into a map and it spirals around to show off the whole area, but the tiling is really obvious, especially compared to Cave Story. Oh well, the lackluster backgrounds aren't that big a deal because Gomez seems to pack a lot more character into his animations than Quote or any of Cave Story's characters did. But let's let's move on to the meat of things. The whole concept of Fez, its main selling point of the 2.5D, was very fresh and interesting in 2007 when it was first announced, but it was just beaten to the punch by several games, including a Flash game called Sky Island. Fez's gameplay is also rather slow-paced, to put it lightly. You simply make your way from place to place in pretty much whatever fashion you please, flipping the world around and picking up cube pieces. Most of the puzzles just involve flipping the perspective about until you can move further, but I guess the QR code one was sort of clever? Sucks if you don't have a smartphone though. This is a bit plain, sure, but it only goes into unforgivable territory when you realise that there are no enemies in the entire game, and if you fall too far, you just respawn right before that jump. No way to die here, unlike Crush or other perspective switching games. I mean, come on, even Sky Island did that right. In the end, gameplay is pretty much Mario 64 in 2D without enemies and with infinite health. Kinda boring when you think of it like that. Cave Story, on the other hand, is a Metroid-style shooter with Mega Man-style level layouts, Gunstar Hero-style bosses, and Zelda-style RPG elements. While none of those parts are particularly original in themselves, the result is definitely a unique experience. The idea of multiple weapons keeps things interesting, even if some of them do end up becoming useless later, and the level up and down system provides a good penalty for getting hit, especially during the boss fights. Another of Cave Story's most praised elements is its soundtrack, which is comprised of chiptunes bumped together to make a nice, jolly atmosphere. With some intense moments or more downbeat tracks when it's appropriate. Cave Story's soundtrack has been compared to such classics as Super Mario Bros. And Zelda in terms of recognisability and catchiness, and I have to agree on that. Every song is fitting and interesting, apart from the Plantation theme, which is just the title reused, but I digress. Fez, on the other hand, doesn't really have any music as such. The soundtrack is comprised of NES-style ambience, with a few hints of melody here and there, but honestly I can't even call this a soundtrack. Rather than creating a sense of engagement, it invites you to relax instead and marvel at how artsy-fartsy the game is. And honestly, this just shows the difference overall between the two games and their philosophies. The main designer behind Fez, Phil Fish, is firmly seated on the bandwagon that John Blow seems to be driving, that his game is to be viewed as art and that comes first, which explains how often the environments are shoved into your face with a 20-second transition, the relaxed ambient tone, and the way that the game generally takes itself far too seriously for an indie platformer. Cave Story, on the other hand, was obviously designed to be a game with interesting mechanics, cool level design, challenging bosses, fun patterns. It's obvious it's meant to engage with the player and stimulate their minds, i.e. the definition of a game. Either Mr. Fish didn't get that memo, or simply doesn't care, which is a shame because I honestly was excited for Fez when it came out. And moving on, I have another little niggle about Fez, and I'd like to question whether or not it even qualifies as art. Art's supposed to be expression of a concept or emotion through creativity, but Fez doesn't express anything. It's like that slutty girl that you used to know at school who doesn't do any work and thinks she can get by on the virtue of being pretty, and unfortunately, unlike the slutty girl who has to get under the desk and suck some dick for the A grade, the gaming media seemed to yet again become starstruck by 3D blocks and proceeded to give Fez a celebratory circle jerk bukkake. Overall, it doesn't fill either of the roles it's attempted well. It's not very good at being art because it's such a vacuous and hollow experience that even Call of Duty has more soul than it, and it's not very good at being a game because of how minimalistic, half-assed and hand-holding the mechanics are. I'm not saying that Cave Story is without its flaws, far from it in fact. Cave Story's final ending is ridiculously cryptic to get to for no apparent reason, and in the last half hour or so of the game, the manageable difficulty curve suddenly becomes a wall with flaming spikes and imps trying to knock you off. Is Cave Story perfect? No, but it's pretty darn astounding, especially when you remember that one man made it over the course of 5 years before tools for amateur game making became commonly available. And most of all, it's much better than Fez's half-baked, pretentious wankery. And at the very least, Cave Story is completely free to play and doesn't cost you 800 Microsoft points. That diamond-encrusted turd does. Listening to me ramble, you should already have a good clue about which of these games is better, but let me sum things up anyway. In terms of gameplay and story, Cave Story definitely wins. Fez is just far too basic and one-dimensional. I would have to say it wins in the musical department too, mainly due to a lack of competition from Fez. And although Cave Story's graphics seem more tangible, I'm gonna go against that and say that Fez has the better graphics overall because of how much character Gomez seems to show. But I personally think that the WiiWare version of Cave Story looks better than both, so... Anyway, in the end, Fez may have looked great in trailers, but the empty and boring end result couldn't warrant Phil Fish's smack talk. On the other hand, Pixel's Cave Story is a wonderful game with lovable characters, well-designed gameplay, fun levels and enemies, and you should go play it. Yep, Cave Story definitely wins here.